Hello, it's me and Mike again, and this is Mike Stevenson Speaks Easy with Alex James. And tonight, baby, we're talking about the 60s. Yeah, I've been
Yes.
listening. I've been sort of refreshing myself while I've been preparing for this, Mike, and thinking about all the because I've been saying that's groovy and stuff like that. Really
Yeah.
groovy. Hasn't language changed? I mean, everything has changed so vastly since then. And when you start to remember it, you think, wow, what have we lost? So tonight's a real treat. We're going to be looking at the 60s. First of all the changes that have happened in our childhoods, things you remember. I'll chip in a bit. And then we're going to talk about how we've come up to being, let's say we get to our 40s, 50s, the best years, because they are the best years, aren't they? Where you know everything and you sort of achieve what you want. And then we'll move on to our next bit after that. So
Fine.
you start then. 1960. Where were you in 62, baby?
1962, I was in secondary school in Kirkcaldy on the Fife Coast of Scotland. And I was not very long at school because I was thrown out. So in the early 60s, I was in Scotland. At the age of 14 and 15, I sang in a band and
Wow. What was the
did
band
really
called?
well. Hmm?
What
It
was
was
the
called the
band called?
Gravediggers, and we had coffin-shaped speakers, which just to add to the atmosphere and the ambience. And I was a bit of a wild singer. I was quite inspired by Keith Moon of The Who.
Oh
And
yeah.
yeah, I was a bit, um, I did smash the microphone stand into the speakers, which I shouldn't have done because it broke them. And unlike The Who, we didn't have lots of money to replace them because they'd been beautifully put together by a joiner friend of ours. So that's where I was in 1962. Um, as a teenager, it was a wildly exciting time because of the birth of a new era of music, of new
Yeah, I
fashion.
was going to say that music,
Yeah, I mean, fashion
magnificent.
evolved through the 60s. And I would characterize the 60s as a post-war era where we've come out of the war completely, um, and people were optimistic. They were largely happy. We still had many of the social challenges that exist today, but the communities in which poverty was all pervading were very harmonious and people looked out for each other.
They did. Do you remember? I mean,
Mm.
I remember it, and I am just a tad younger than you, but I do remember it. So I'm sure it was part of your childhood too. People would go out and leave their strings in the letterbox to the front door key, and you just reach inside and get the
Yeah.
key.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was a time where people trusted each other. Um, there were very few tensions around. Of course, when I went to London, I did see B&B hotels with no blacks, no Irish on the window, which took me aback. I didn't mention Scots, thankfully, but it was a different time because I think that we were going somewhere. Society had come out of war. Our parents didn't talk about the war at all. Not at all.
No,
My
that's
father,
strange, isn't it? They
yeah, yeah,
didn't.
he was in the desert. He was fighting
Yeah.
Rommel's army, and he never talked about the war. I
No.
think there was a lot of trauma post-war. So a lot of the men in particular, you know, carried themselves with dignity, but quite quietly. And and I think that my memory of it is that it was the first time that the younger generation had kind of split off and were
Mm.
developing their own unique culture.
Do
And
you
of course, it
remember
was a
the
time of music.
freedom,
Hmm?
though? sorry to talk over you, Mike. The freedom. I mean, the freedom that we had.
Mm.
I was a Coventry kid then, and we used to play on the bomb sites. We'd go and
Yeah.
hang out. I mean, I don't know if you had bomb sites where you were, but we used to play
Not
on
in
them.
Kirkcaldy, but
And we used to sit on
mm,
doorsteps and late at night and
yeah, yeah.
play around lampposts and the
Well,
freedom out till late.
yeah. And I
What's
think,
changed? Why has that
well,
what's happened that's changed that?
I think the psychology of parents at that time was to allow your children to live a free life because they've been through this traumatic war which lasted for
Mm.
so long. And so there were no threats. Well, there were no obvious threats. So we wandered freely. I mean, I would leave the house first thing in the morning and I wouldn't come back until I smelled dinner on the table. And I smelt it from about 10 miles away. So that gave me quite a long lead to work with. So it was a time of freedom because post-war, all people wanted was to live a life and
Yeah.
reconnect socially. And it was a good time socially because people invited each other to each other's houses. The women had coffee mornings, they met up. It was a time of social interaction.
Do you think
And
that that kept people safer? Because I do. I think
mm,
that because we were more of a community, everybody was more about being together, and knowing, and they knew who the neighbors were. And I don't know
yeah,
about you, but I remember being told, don't go up the end of that street, don't go by that person. If that person talks to you, you come back
mm,
or you tell an adult or whatever. There was like
yeah.
the parents seemed to know who was in the area. So
Yeah, and
you were
also
safe.
children have got antennae too. I mean, we knew instinctively who was a wrong and we just avoided them. We gave them nicknames, actually, usually quite disparaging nicknames. And yes, it was a time of freedom. It was a time of exploration. The music thing was huge, and all young people seemed to be engaged in something that they were passionate about. Music, fashion, sport, all these things. And from that point of view, there was no one left hanging in the shelf. That's what it felt like. And when I went down to London, I was there, time of Carnaby Street, the beginnings of King's Road,
Wow.
the fashionistas, the Marquee. I used to go to the Marquee Club on a Monday night, and saw all these bands, these emerging bands. I saw Yes, and they were still playing Beatles songs at the time. And it was an extraordinary time. And also, I rejoiced in the interracial relationships I had in London. And there were far more in London than I could enjoy back in Kirkcaldy. We just had a new Indian restaurant and a new Chinese restaurant, different ends of the high street in Kirkcaldy. And that was just like a flower to the bees. Everyone wanted to go. And even though they had ham and a bit of pineapple and chips, they were eating in a Chinese restaurant, and the Chinese made better chips anyway. So it was a time of, new beginnings, and the Pakistanis opened shops, and they opened every day of the year. I mean, everything closed on New Year's Day here, and
Mm.
probably the 2nd and probably the 3rd of January too. Yet the Asian shops were open all the time. They started open till 11 o'clock at night, and it was extraordinary.
And Sundays,
Well, Sundays
nothing
were
was open
quiet.
on Sundays.
Yeah,
Everybody had Sunday lunch. The men went up the pub.
yeah, yeah,
Well, most of them did.
yes,
And then they'd come back and you'd have Sunday lunch and you'd get your
yeah.
stuff ready for school if that's where you were going, or you'd be going to, yeah, all the TV. Do you remember all the TV programs that were on then?
Well,
there was a strange sort of mix of TV programs.
I remember Z Cars was big, Emergency Ward 10,
Yep.
Dr. Kildare,
Yep.
And there was a program called The Defenders, which is on, I think it must have been 9 o'clock on BBC. And I remember watching, we'd only had a television for 18 months at that stage. And suddenly the program was interrupted, and it was the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And that was huge news because his arrival as American president was also the dawn of optimism and hope. And you remember he made the statement, this is just after the Cuba crisis, where we were, that was the last crisis I could remember before today, when the world was genuinely on the brink of atomic war or nuclear war.
Yeah.
And Kennedy come out and said, we're going to put a man on the moon and bring him safely back to Earth by the end of this decade. And suddenly this Cold War, between two great nuclear powers became a space race. It was a moment of genius. And so there was hope. We were looking up to something, forward to something. And the next time I remember a dip in morale was the Vietnam War, which rumbled on. And it seemed to get worse, and we could not understand why America was embroiled in this war with Vietnam. Britain refused. Harold Wilson said, no, we're not getting involved. Does that resonate with you now? And of course, America didn't win that war. So that was the only thing I remember. It was a shadow over proceedings. But this was a time of underground newspapers, and there was a freedom to express. And if you think
Mm.
about the music of that time, it was full of hope. And that's the overriding memory I've got. It was hope and it was new language. So young people were developing their own language, fabulous. I remember the Sunday night at the London Palladium where Norman Vaughan would come on as the compere and go swinging, dodgy. I don't know if you remember that. And the adults were trying to take on the children's language. So I enjoyed the 60s hugely, not only because I was young, and part of that I was sleeping out, remember? For almost 2 years of that time, I was sleeping out in London. So, but I still enjoyed it because there was a kind of point when all the girls coming from the West End into the Piccadilly area, or coming from outside London, from Middlesex and Surrey and Sussex, would come along to Piccadilly Circus, and I'd be there, you know, round about the statue of Eros. And they didn't say homeless, they said, ah, you're hippies. So suddenly you became an attraction rather than something to avoid.
Were you
And
living in a squat at any time? Did you?
yes, I did. I was actually a couple of nights in 100 Piccadilly. Not the night it was invaded by the police. I don't know if you remember that.
No.
There's a guy called Phil Cohen. I remember him. He was a very active guy who wanted to subvert the whole property business. So the business of squatting came up, and this was a large building in number 100 Piccadilly. I'm sure that was the address, and it was on the news every night. And BBC cameras were always in and around there. And I think there was a raid one night, and they were all cleared out. But it was it was that kind of time where we were pushing the boundaries and saying, we've had rules through wartime. This is a time of freedom. We want to live our lives. We want to push the boundaries. We want to experiment in our own way. And by and large, parents were accepting of that, if very reluctantly. And suddenly there was this huge divide. I mean, I remember going to a girl's house. She invited me back to meet her parents, and her father was smoking a pipe and he had a moustache, and he was ex-RAF. And he looked at me and he goes, "Oh God." But actually, I got on really well with him because he found out, I was a pretty bright guy. I could talk about Malaya and Ceylon and the age of British colonialism. So he was quite impressed with that. But the divide was huge, and great time to be young. Yeah.
Right. So now, Move it forward. Let's go forward to the 70s, 80s. Where were you then?
Well, I went back to
Oh, we have
London.
to include the 90s as well. So we're going into
Yeah,
your
yeah.
mid years and let's go up to the age of say 55, 60
Oh my
maybe.
goodness. That's okay.
Let's
Well,
take it up that far then.
yeah, the 1970s for me became a bit sanitized in the early years.
Mm.
Um, and the music became quite safe. And that was a disappointment to me because all the crackling excitement of the 60s seemed to die down a bit. But it was also a time when there were electricity cuts. And I remember it was a 3-day week. So it
Yeah.
was a time when the unions were asserting
Miners'
themselves.
strikes.
Yeah. And I stayed in Shepherd's Bush at this stage. I had a flat. And I used to go across to a pub called the Black Prince on the evenings where the lights went out because they had candles on the bar. And it was all very nice. It was very cozy. But that was a decade of, tension, growing tension between the unions who were becoming more powerful and the government and the business owners. So it was, I think, the beginning of a period of discomfort. There was growth, but it was nothing like the growth of the 60s. So
Mm.
things began to even out towards the end of the 70s, and people were being feeling the pinch. There were more strikes, there were more people unemployed. During the 60s, you could get a job on the same day that you told yourself you were going to go for a job. It was that simple.
Mm.
It was full employment. And we should never forget what that felt like, that young boys could go into trades, go into apprenticeships as soon as they left school. And Billy Connolly talks about the shipyards. You would just go from leaving school straight to the shipyards and you'd queue up with all the rest of them. And he was taken on as a welder, I think. And so it was that easy to get a job. And now we're beginning to see unemployment just creeping up. So the idea that you could just leave one job and go into another job was
Yeah.
beginning to fade. I
I
mean,
loved it. I loved
yes, I loved
all
it
the
as well.
different
Yeah,
music. I loved all the
yeah, of
Motown and the reggae and
course. Well,
fabulous.
yeah,
And then if we go into the 80s, the threat of AIDS came along.
yes,
And we had all of those TV commercials and things, don't
yeah,
die of ignorance.
yeah,
I mean, that was a very scary, I found that quite scary. I don't know
yes.
where you were. Did you have any friends who died of AIDS?
Oh, yes. Quite a
Mm.
few, actually. Um, and that was very scary. Of course, Edinburgh was the capital of AIDS at the
Was
time.
it?
Yeah, because of sheer needles. Um, and then, of course, train spotting. Remember train spotting? So I remember moving to Glasgow, not because of that. And say, where are you from? From Edinburgh. Oh, the AIDS city,
But you would have
Sin
been
City.
like in your how old were you then in 1980s when that
Well, I was in my
happened?
30s. I was 30 in 1980.
Were you still
Um,
single?
no, I've been in a relationship for 4 years,
Or see, you
five
were
years.
relatively safe then out of that. I mean, for single people, it
Yeah,
must have been a nightmare.
yeah. But then
The
I went
80s.
out and was single again, so I was okay. But the 80s I found difficult because for me, the biggest mistake Britain's ever made was to deindustrialize and put everything into the service sector, mainly finance. And I saw this happening, and of course, in cities like Glasgow, it was catastrophic. You know, I remember reading a book, and in the opening, in the description of the era, which is around 1984, it said, Glasgow in the morning, fathers and sons had nowhere to go because all the jobs had gone. They closed down shipbuilding. Then we had railway. There was a whole railway industry in Glasgow, so they built engines. And, we lost a lot. And of course, the pits were closing as well. So that was a hugely destructive period for me. And it it disturbed something that I think had been quite a British model, where you had people making things. And it wasn't just people making things. I mean, I worked in the steelworks in Sheffield for a while in the early 70s too. They were making the finest steel in the world. And the stainless steel stuff, the the produce was beautiful. It was the highest quality. In Glasgow, they made by far and away the best ships in the world. Do you remember the launch of the QE2
I
in the
do.
Atlantic? Yeah. I mean, these were brilliant times for British industry. And productivity was falling because they needed to update the machinery and the equipment. I know because I worked in the steelworks and they were working at a disadvantage. It was still antiquated, what they were using. So calling them out for productivity was the wrong thing to do. They needed to modernise. But the Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, said, Germany can have all the industry. And then, of course, Germany went into a huge boom. It took on engineering, it produced the best cars, produced the best white goods, the best electronics, you know. So it was a huge mistake, and we never recover from that, I don't think. And it's why we get such, hits from global economics, because we're not making anything. We have to import everything. And that leaves you at a huge disadvantage in times of economic uncertainty. So the 80s, yes, it was good. It was good for me.
Mm.
I learnt a lot during that era. I became a leader in Glasgow, where I was, one of the heads of this large organization. I learnt so much about leadership. I learnt so much about, how to communicate with people. And it was a growth time for me, a huge growth time. And I enjoyed it, but I saw the pain of this sudden deindustrialization on a city like Glasgow. And I mean, Glasgow built with the most beautiful Victorian buildings. I mean, people who haven't been to Glasgow would be astonished by its architecture. It was
Mm.
built on the backs of, the shipping companies, the Indian tea companies, tobacco. They may not be to our liking now, but this was a city built with a huge amount of civic consideration. It's got more parks than any other city, more green space, a brilliant building program, and of course they had the council housing program as well. But then there was this huge move to move people from city centres to the outer estates where they
Do
built
you
new
think that
houses.
that's where communities started to break down?
Yeah, and communities broke down because you emptied out the city centres, places like the Gorbals. They were in good tenements, so they moved them out to estates and people meeting each other for the first time. They're not being as close to each other geographically.
People didn't know each other, did they? So that must
No,
have been
no. And there were
where,
no
for the
facilities.
children, things
Yeah, yeah,
started to change. Because, of course, if you've moved to an alien landscape where you don't know people, you're
exactly.
not going to be letting your kids
Yeah,
up the road where other people are going to be watching them or know where they are anymore.
yes.
So that's where and you said earlier on about the fear of of foreigners, and maybe that started to come in and seep in under the door, and so people became more wary of what their children were doing and where they were, and maybe
Yeah,
started to instill that fear in them, whereas we
yeah,
learned intuitively
yes.
and from our own experiences. There was a way that we could do that, but this was more about, we don't know who people are anymore, and we're
Yeah.
living in a different place. And of course, they split up from their families, didn't they? Because they had to move for work.
Well, of course, that was the thing. And of course, if you live on the outskirts of a large city, then travel to work, if you get a job, is going to be much longer. You're
Mm.
waiting at windy, rainy bus stops in the morning, to take a bus which might take 50 minutes to get to the city centre, and you have to do the whole thing at night again. That was difficult for communities like Glasgow and Liverpool
Mm.
and Manchester, all the big industrial cities. And that was a huge decline for me in all the things that made our society, you know, quite cohesive. And it was able to absorb people coming in really quite easily when the resistance went, when this silly resistance went. And of course, the reason we brought people from the West Indies into Britain was to
Mm.
build the country back to where it was and build afresh. So they were here for a reason. And of course, the Asians, they brought in food, huge Italian immigration in Scotland because many of the prisoners of war, the Italian prisoners of war, they stayed here. They didn't go back. So there was a big Italian community and they gave us, ice cream and restaurants. So we were enjoying a sort of renaissance on food. And that has been a huge development in Britain. But the deindustrialization meant that after the 60s, it was a kind of managed decline, really. And then
Yeah.
the axe fell in the early 80s. And that cut a swathe through society. It was a huge body
Mm.
blow to large communities and cities and large towns. So that was a decline for me. Um,
And then if we move forward to your 40s and 50s, but you were quite successful during those years, weren't you?
well, I set up business in Edinburgh in 1993 after 10 years in Glasgow.
Mm.
And John Major, yeah, the economy was good. Um, it was a good time for entrepreneurs. It was a good time to grow things. Um, and then the Blair government came along and there was money everywhere. That's what it felt like. It
Mm.
wasn't in actual fact. It was still, a lot of people out of work, but it was a time of growth. And then um, it all ended badly with the Iraq War, which was catastrophic. Um, and the 90s was good. I mean, it was kind of, when Blair came in, there was a huge surge of optimism right up and down the country. And you could see people smiling again and talking about the future. And, things like the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, which was started by John Major and completed by Blair, that was a huge relief of tension in Northern Ireland. And of course, we'd had this, throughout the 80s, this tension with Ireland, which, meant that there were bombs in Birmingham and Guildford, and it was a difficult time, a very difficult time. And I'd
Mm.
been living in Ireland, so I understood the the anger in Ireland. If we were honest, the British were horrible to the Irish. I mean, it was a cruel, very cruel period of British domination. So I understood where that came from. It wasn't
Mm.
just people being bloody minded. So the 90s had a bit of repair and recovery, but more and more emphasis put on the City of London, the financial sector. And I don't want to live in a country where our main industry is finance. That's just me as a personal thing. And that's why the 60s was so good, because we had this balance. We had jobs. We had people producing things. We had makers, small makers. We had business people setting up small, tool houses and sheds and doing things from their own home. So it was a
Mm.
good time. And I think also it was the time when people had children. The baby boomer
Mm.
generation was born because post-war, you can imagine, the sun was shining again, birds were twittering in the trees. There was no bombing, no sirens, no one felt unsafe. So It was a hugely positive time. I mean, I was born through rationing, so there was still rationing for a few years. I had to have an identity card when I was born. I remember it. So the years after the war, in the immediate aftermath, the National Health Service was set up around that time. So we had a
Mm.
National Health Service, and all these things. So it was in a good place, Britain, in a very good place.
But
And
then we've gone into the 90s now, and we're coming up to
yeah,
2000, where you had now you've moved through those years, and you've talked about the what was going on in the country.
mm,
But I want to know what was going on with you. What were you doing in 1998, 99, 2000? What were you doing then?
well, I'd been in business and we're doing really well, really well. So I had money in my pocket. I was able to drive nice cars. I had a really good team. I enjoyed it because it was a time for me to get creative and also to build relationships and bring clients in. We wanted to do things differently for our clients, so we did. We offered a lot of extra value, and I love that whole part of the business of getting to know clients, building relationships with them, giving them added value. It's when I started speaking. Because, for example, if we had been given the commission to rebrand an organization, I would say, look, I want to know something about where you want to be. I want to know something about the culture of the organization and where people feel they're at and what people's aspirations are. So I went and spoke to people and I gathered information. I did creative workshops with them. And that I loved that. That was me in my absolute element. I mean, I've been a musician, as you know. I'd busked in Dublin.
Mm.
I played some of the festivals. I'd done a bit of acting. I'd been on Taggart and, you know, various things. And this was just me talking with no guitar, no script. And I loved it. So it was a very good time for me because, I had money, I had security, or I thought I had security. And I was working really, really hard. I loved being in business. I loved the relationship with the clients. I loved the networking.
What was it that you did? What was it that you did? Are you
Yeah, I had
able
a
to sort
creative
of tell us
agency
what you did?
and we did campaigns and we also did quite a few publications. So we did magazines, corporate magazines, and that was very lucrative. Um, so it was just a great time. I,
You must have been mixing quite a lot
mhm.
then to do that. A lot of networking, a
Oh
lot of.
yeah.
But you weren't public speaking
No, I
then, or were
started
you?
doing it by request. So I never thought, I'm going to be a speaker. Didn't cross my mind.
Mm.
But I've been doing it for a few years, not professionally, but by invitation. And so it became part of me being a business leader at that time. I was asked to go and speak. And I loved that. I loved every part of it. And it wasn't until the banking crisis when things went quite badly wrong for the business and for me. But up until that time, I was having a great time. And during the holidays, I would travel far and wide. Um, and I just loved that time of my life. It was largely on my own, a couple of in-out relationships. Don't ask me why, but nothing stuck at that time. But I really loved it. And Edinburgh, it's quite a culinary centre now. So during that time, Michelin star restaurants opening up. And we've got four within, a few hundred yards of my house here. And I loved the eating out because I could afford to do it. And I was able to fly down to London at the drop of a hat. Went to a few CBI dinners and Institute of Directors things down in London. Met some of the political leaders. Um, and yes, some were nicer than others. But I felt that I was part of something much bigger than myself, and that's a really nice place to be when you feel you're making a contribution, you're doing something you love, you're working with people who are doing a great job, and you're getting great feedback from your clients. There's nothing better than that. And of course, invited out to all kinds of dinners, and it was a good time.
So we're going to talk about that next time. But if we
Mhm.
just reflect on today, where you've taken us, so we've come through from the 60s, that really lovely time. We've got some really great shots of you as well, one with the long hair and the guitar on your back because you were busking and you had your band and music. And it was such a time of hope.
Mm.
And then, with all the different things that have gone on politically, how people have shifted, communities have broken down, and that sort of childhood that we had will never happen again for children. Children will never experience
No.
that freedom
Well,
ever again, which is terribly sad.
we
And I know that's
devalue,
something that,
well,
yeah,
we devalue the word community, you
yeah,
know, and community is something. It's not a tangible, it's an intangible. But you know when you're part of a community, you know when you feel safe.
yes.
You know when you can go to a neighbour's house and they'll look out for you. You know that if something goes wrong, everyone on the street will come out to help you. And those things are precious. They're really precious. You know you can let your children out and they'll be looked out for by other people in the area.
And you
Um,
knew you could go out and have a conversation. If you went into a
yeah,
shop, the butcher knew you, the baker
yeah,
knew
yeah.
you, the fishmonger knew you, everybody knew you
Well,
and would ask how things were.
there was an
And if you were having
aesthetic.
a hard time, I mean,
Yeah.
I remember butchers putting an extra chop in or something. Or there was a lot of that, wasn't there? A lot of care in the community,
Butchers were always happy people as they were
which
chopping
is
things. They're always laughing and smiling. Look, I know, and when you build up a relationship with a shopkeeper, and I remember my mum back in Kirkcaldy, you know, going to the grocers, and grocers had great smells, around the shop. Um, and she would get the butter pats, they'd make them in
hmm,
little pats. They weren't all wrapped up, and they had chunks of cheese, and they would chop the cheese with a wire cutter. So,
yeah,
and meat was put in a pack, and you went home with brown bags, brown bags, or maybe a box. So the whole experience of shopping changed. It went from being an experience where the shopkeepers would guide you on new things that came in or introduce it. You must taste these almond biscuits. They've just come in and I find them delicious. Have a taste, you know? And that was good because shopping becomes habitual. I used to love going shopping with my mum because you went to the baker, you went to the butcher, you went to the greengrocer,
yeah.
you went to the fishmonger, and lots of small shops. Kirkcaldy
And there
High
were
Street was
conversations. They knew you.
conversations everywhere, and always telling you about something new that's just come in,
Yeah.
getting you to taste it. It was an interaction. So you're being educated in your mind and your palate. And I remember, right up into my 30s, I would, when I was still staying in Edinburgh, I would wander down the street just adjacent to my house, and we had everything in that street, every kind of shop, and some competition. So when I went to the butcher, he would say, Mike, I've got some of that lamb you love, and I'll cube it for you. Are you making a curry? And I would say, oh, yeah, thank you. So you can't get that in a supermarket.
Mm.
You don't get that kind of interaction in a supermarket. So everything's wrapped. So you're not smelling anything in a supermarket. But the sensation of going into a shop an old grocer's shop or a delicatessen. You're smelling things. It's,
Yeah.
your senses are being educated and stimulated and excited. You know, your senses are dancing. But we've taken all of that away because we now buy things by label and they're wrapped up tightly. And you don't
And
know
we
what the
don't go to
source is.
shops, we have it delivered.
Yeah, yeah,
So everything
yeah,
to do with community
yes,
has gently slipped away.
yes. I mean, I think that Britain essentially is a nation of small businesses, small to medium-sized businesses. It always was. And some of them make it more successful, like Boots. Boots
Mm.
became global. They got investors because of the City of London. It got bigger and bigger and bigger. But we had Timothy White's, we had Boots, and we had lots of independent chemists, pharmacists. And again, they had these beautiful wooden kind of display cabinets, and all the old
Yeah,
medicine jars,
I
and
remember.
it was just everything was so sensual. It was
But even
sensory,
even
you
just
know?
moving away from that, when you said that, you just reminded me. We'd go to the doctors, and you used to sit on a chair, and you'd move along until you got to the door, and then it was your turn.
Yeah.
I mean, that
Well,
just
I think the other thing I can talk about with some um, authority is when I was young, I had really bad asthma. So I was always being taken into hospital. And I remember the care, the care and the conversation that actually getting to know the nurses was part of your healing.
every time we sort of get forward, we are both drifting back to that time because our memories are so rich, aren't they, of those times and
Mm,
the freedom that was there, and that isn't
mm.
there now. So what happened? How do we kind of put that together and say, well, this is where we are because of that? What's happened?
Okay.
How do you want to sort of
Well,
close this one with?
okay. My take is that we've gone wrong in terms of business culture. We've got
Mm,
huge corporates. They're very influential over government. In fact, they're incredibly influential over government. And so we've lost this personal service thing that mattered so much to people. And it wasn't just about, reducing social isolation so older people could go and they could always have a chat.
mm,
It was also about educating us on our foods, the things we buy. So there was an interaction. And the people who worked in the shops, they knew what was happening. They were at the vanguard of new developments, new foods, and new imports. And all that went. And we also had great pride in the stuff we produced. Ships, steel, we had the mines. We were a business society where people felt valued at work. They felt valued. And they were part
mm.
of a work community. And often, houses were built around those industries. So in Sheffield, you got the steel workers' houses.
Yeah.
In, fishing villages, you had the fishing cottages. And of course, in miners' communities were great examples because here was a cohesive community. The men went down the pits during the day,
Mm.
and the women organized the nursery and the cooking and all the community events. It was a very cohesive society, and of course they had these miners clubs. So that went when we went down this route of big capital investments from abroad, getting rid of our public services like water. I We still have nationalised water in Scotland. Now got a nationalised rail network, and it runs really well. And they've done away with peak fares in Scotland because the government can see that as a way to
Mm.
help people not be penalised because they have to go to work. all of those things. So those sensitivities have gone because we've been sold out, and so many industries have just grown and grown and become integrated. And now you've got private equity companies who are your employers. I mean, I went to one place I was speaking at. I won't tell you the name of the company, but it was around Preston. And I said, "So what's the leadership like?" "I don't know. Private equity, never seen them, don't know who they are. We don't know what they want. We just get orders from someone who's anonymous." You think,
It's so sad. It's
that's
so
so sad.
sad, isn't it? It is
Yeah.
sad. But we're out of time on this one, but we'll pick it up
Yeah.
next time we
Okay.
talk. And next time we talk, I'm kind of sad, really, in a way, because I suppose I was kind of hoping to keep the vibe of the 60s, but you kind of brought my awareness to how much I've
Well,
lost now, in a
well,
way, I
yeah, but
guess.
you've gone
Wouldn't it be
from,
great if it's like that
you did say
today?
the
But
70s, the 80s, and the 90s, to be
oh
fair.
yeah, they were okay, but I think 60s, 70s,
Yeah.
just a very special time. And I think we were really
Yes.
fortunate
And it
to have
wasn't
had
just our
that.
age,
No,
because
no,
my parents would have said exactly the same thing.
yeah.
You know?
Anyway, we'll end that one there, and
Okay.
we will be speaking again next time. It's still going to be a speakeasy, but the next time we're going to be talking about where you are now and the new idea that you're having, which may just
Okay.
inspire other people to join you.
Yeah.
So join us next time. Bye, baby.
Thank you. Bye.